The blizzard screamed through the torn canvas of the field hospital, deep in the dead zone where borders meant nothing and mercy meant less. Night fell fast here, cold enough to numb thought itself. Inside, a night nurse moved quietly between cots, changing dressings, administering morphine, wiping blood from her sleeves with practiced efficiency. No one paid attention to her eyes, calm to the point of unnatural. Then gunfire cracked through the storm. The lights flickered and died. The hospital was breached. Armed men poured through the darkness. Nobody knew. That nurse had once been a sniper. Not until the first shot rang out through the white night. The field hospital sat like a wound in the frozen landscape, canvas and corrugated metal held together by desperation and wire. It wasn't supposed to be here this long. 3 months ago, it was meant to be temporary, a week, maybe 2, while the peace talks progressed. But peace talks had a way of dying in this region, and the wounded kept coming. Nurse Catherine Brennan moved through the dim corridor between surgical tents, her breath visible in the inadequate heat. The generators rattled constantly, burning through fuel they could barely spare, keeping just enough power for the operating theater and the ICU section. Everything else ran on battery packs, oil lamps, and sheer stubbornness. Vitals on bed 7? Dr. Vernon Hayes called from the scrub station, elbow deep in disinfectant that smelled more like industrial solvent. Stable, BP holding at 1 to 10 over 70, Catherine replied without consulting her chart. She knew every patient's numbers by heart. Bed 7 was Corporal Daniel Reeves, 23, shrapnel wounds from a roadside device. He'd lost his left leg below the knee but kept his sense of humor somehow. That morning he'd asked her if the hospital cafeteria served anything besides mystery stew and regret. "You tell him about the transfer?" Vernon asked, drying his hands on a towel that had seen better decades. "He knows. Tomorrow, if the weather clears." Catherine adjusted the IV drip on bed 3. An older man, civilian, caught in crossfire while trying to evacuate his village. No ID, barely conscious when they brought him in. "Will it clear?" Vernon glanced toward the canvas wall, where wind punched at the fabric like something alive. "Forecast says maybe. Forecast also said this storm would pass yesterday." Catherine nodded. She'd learned not to trust forecasts here. The weather changed as quickly as the front lines. Last week they'd had 3 sunny days warm enough that ice melt turned the compound to mud, and then the temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight. 4 cases of frostbite from soldiers who'd gotten careless. She finished her rounds in the main ward, then moved to the supply tent to restock her field bag. The inventory was getting dire. They were down to their last case of IV antibiotics. Morphine supplies were rationed to only the worst cases, and they'd been improvising bandages from torn bed sheets for a week. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, head of the 12-soldier security detail, stood outside the supply entrance, smoking a cigarette that glowed like a tiny beacon in the dark. "Evening, Kate." Marcus. She didn't break stride. Marcus was decent enough former military police, competent, not prone to the chest-puffing bravado that got people killed, but she didn't encourage conversation. "You working another double?" "Someone has to." She paused at the entrance, sensing his unease. "Something wrong?" Marcus took a long drag, the ember flaring. "Radio chatter's been weird. Encrypted bursts on frequencies we don't usually monitor. Could be nothing. Could be nothing usually means something." "Yeah." He dropped the cigarette, ground it under his boot. "Just keep your head down tonight. Don't do anything heroic." Catherine almost smiled at that. Never do. She left him there and entered the supply tent. Inside, she methodically packed her bag. Sterile gloves, syringes, suture kits, pressure bandages, saline. Her hands moved with automatic precision, but her mind was elsewhere. She'd noticed things today. Small things. The way the perimeter guards had changed shifts early. How the radio operator, Sarah Chen, kept glancing toward the northern approach. The absence of the usual supply convoy delayed. They said, weather conditions. Small things that added up to a feeling she'd learned never to ignore. Catherine checked the window vent, a small gap in the canvas that offered a sight line to the northern ridge. Through the falling snow, she could see nothing but white darkness. But she looked anyway, cataloging angles and distances out of habit. Some instincts never died. By 2100 hours, the storm had intensified into something malevolent. Snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond 10 feet, and the wind drove ice crystals through every gap in the hospital's defenses. The temperature had dropped to -15°C colder inside than out, it seemed, as if the cold was something alive that had decided to take up residence. Catherine was in the ICU tent when communications specialist Sarah Chen came through, her face tight with worry. "We lost contact with the supply depot," Sarah said quietly, not wanting to alarm the patients. "And the patrol that went out this morning hasn't checked in." Dr. Vernon Hayes looked up from the patient he was examining, a young woman, civilian, appendectomy gone, complicated by infection. "How long overdue?" 3 hours. That was bad. Protocol required check-ins every hour. 3 hours meant something had gone very wrong. Catherine continued cleaning the wound drain on her patient, but her attention sharpened. "Could be radio failure," Vernon offered, though his tone said he didn't believe it. "We tried multiple frequencies. Nothing." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to the sidearm holstered at her hip, standard issue for all personnel, though most of the medical staff never touched theirs. "Lieutenant Webb wants to implement lockdown protocols." Vernon nodded slowly. "Do it. Nobody leaves the compound. Double the perimeter watch." He glanced at Catherine. "Prep the emergency transport kits, just in case." "Already done," Catherine said. She'd prepared them an hour ago, when she'd noticed the third guard change of the evening. Marcus was rotating his people, too frequently sign of heightened alert. As Sarah left, Vernon moved closer to Catherine, voice low. "You seem remarkably unworried. Would worry help?" Catherine checked the IV line, adjusted the flow rate. Her hands were steady. "No, I suppose not." Vernon studied her for a moment. "How long were you in before this?" "Military, I mean." "I wasn't military." The lie came easily, worn smooth by repetition. She'd been using it for 3 years. Just nursing school and emergency medicine. Right. Vernon didn't push, but something in his expression said he didn't quite believe her. "Well, emergency medicine or not, I'm glad you're on shift tonight." Catherine finished her work in the ICU, then made her rounds through the main ward. Most patients were sleeping, doped on pain medication or exhaustion. She checked Corporal Reeves. His stump was healing well. No signs of infection, and the civilian with no name, whose breathing had finally stabilized. As she worked, she found herself mapping the space in ways that had nothing to do with nursing. The main ward had 3 exits, the primary entrance facing the supply depot, a side door leading to the surgical tent, and a rear access point that opened to the generator shed. Canvas walls on 3 sides, corrugated metal on the north face, the side most exposed to enemy approach. 14 patients currently in the ward, 8 ambulatory, 6 bedridden. Nearest cover, the supply cabinets, metal framed, could stop small arms fire. Sightlines compromised by the tent poles and hanging lamps. She caught herself cataloging and forced her attention back to her actual job. At 2,300 hours, the lights flickered. Catherine was changing dressings on bed 12 when everything went dark. Emergency lighting kicked in after 3 seconds, battery-powered LED strips that cast everything in harsh white shadow. "Generator's fine," someone called. Something cut the main line. Through the canvas wall, Catherine heard what everyone else missed. The soft crunch of boots on snow, moving with tactical precision. Multiple sets, approaching from the north. She set down her supplies and walked calmly to the window, looked out into the white darkness. Nothing visible, but they were there. Catherine's pulse didn't change. Her breathing stayed even. But something inside her, something she'd buried 3 years ago, began to wake up. The glass shattered inward at exactly 2,317 hours. Catherine registered it before her conscious mind processed the sound. A small window on the north wall kicked in, followed by a percussion grenade that hadn't been set to explode, just to disorient. Then they came through the entrances. 6 men, possibly 7, dressed in mismatched tactical gear and carrying weapons that ranged from military-issue rifles to improvised firearms. Their faces were wrapped against the cold, only eyes visible, but Catherine noted their formation immediately professional enough to be dangerous, sloppy enough to be desperate. "Everyone down! Face down! Now!" The leader's accent was local, his English heavily inflected but clear enough. He punctuated his command with a burst of gunfire into the ceiling. The patients who could move dropped, the ones who couldn't just lay there, already horizontal, eyes wide with terror. Dr. Vernon raised his hand slowly. "We're medical personnel. This is a protected facility." "Shut up!" The leader smashed his rifle butt across Vernon's jaw, sending him sprawling. Blood poured from his mouth. "You think we care about your rules? Your protection?" 2 of the insurgents moved through the ward, checking each bed. They were looking for something. Someone. Catherine had dropped with the others, but her mind was moving at double speed, processing everything. The leader was mid-30s, moved with military training. 2 of his men were younger, nervous the way they held their weapons, fingers too tight on the triggers. Those were the dangerous ones. Scared men made mistakes. The remaining 4 spread through the hospital, shouting in multiple languages, herding staff into the main ward. Communications, Specialist Sarah Chen was shoved through the entrance, hands zip-tied behind her back. Lieutenant Marcus Webb came next, blood streaming from a gash above his eye, his hands also bound. His service weapon was gone. "Please," Sarah was saying, voice shaking. "Please, we're just trying to help people." "Help?" The leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You help them," he gestured to the patients. "You help the people who burned our village, who killed our families. You sew them up so they can come back and kill more. We help everyone," Vernon managed through his broken mouth. "We don't choose sides." "Then you chose the wrong side." The leader pulled out a list, handwritten, names in block letters. "We're looking for someone. Colonel James Garrett. You have him here." Catherine's mind flashed through the patient roster. No Garrett, no colonels, just the civilian in bed 3. No ID, barely conscious when they brought him in. The leader was moving between the beds, checking faces against a photograph he pulled from his vest. When he reached bed 3, he stopped, smiled. "Found you." The man in the bed, Garrett, apparently didn't react. Still too sedated, or too injured. The leader grabbed him by his hospital gown. "You remember me? You remember what you did?" "He's critically injured," Catherine said, her voice calm, steady, cutting through the chaos. Everyone turned to look at her. "He won't survive being moved." "Good." The leader's smile widened. "Then he dies here. But first, he watches." He nodded to his men. 2 of them grabbed Sarah Chen. No, Marcus tried to stand, and one of the nervous ones hit him with a rifle stock, hard enough that the crack echoed through the tent. Catherine was still on the floor, positioned near the back of the ward, close to the supply cabinets. Her hands were visible, empty, non-threatening. But her eyes were calculating, the leader and 2 men near the front, one watching the surgical tent entrance, one by the side door. At least 2 more outside. She'd heard their voices. 7 inside, probably 3 outside. 10 total, maybe more. 14 patients, 6 staff members now in the ward. Everyone at risk. The leader was dragging Sarah toward the entrance. "We take this one outside, make an example. Then we come back for the rest." Vernon was pleading now. Others were crying. The patients who could understand what was happening were frozen in terror. Catherine's breathing slowed. Her heart rate dropped. The chaos around her began to organize itself into patterns, lines of fire, angles of approach, distances measured in fractions of seconds. She'd told herself 3 years ago that she was done with this, that she'd put away that part of herself forever, that the person who'd done those things was someone else. But that person was waking up now, cold and precise and absolutely certain. If she didn't act, everyone would die. The moment came at 2000, 324 hours. The leader had Sarah halfway to the door, his grip brutal on her arm. The 2 nervous ones were watching the staff, weapons sweeping back and forth. The others were checking the remaining tents, shouting commands, firing warning shots that made everyone flinch. Chaos, disorder, their attention divided. Catherine moved. Not fast drew attention. She moved with the deliberate slowness of someone adjusting position, shifting her weight like her leg had fallen asleep. She slid 6 inches closer to the metal supply cabinet, her body positioning itself without conscious thought. The man guarding the side entrance turned his back for 3 seconds to yell something to his partner outside. 3 seconds. Catherine's hand found the cabinet door, eased it open. Inside, under the bottom shelf where they kept the sharps disposal and the old equipment, there was a crowbar maintenance tool, left there 2 weeks ago by the engineer who'd reinforced the tent poles. Her fingers closed around cold metal. She didn't take it out yet, just held it, feeling its weight, its balance. 30 inches long, steel, maybe 8 pounds. Not a weapon she'd trained with, but close enough to a rifle stock in mass and momentum. The leader was at the entrance now, dragging Sarah into the storm. "You all watch," he shouted back. "Watch what happens to collaborators." That's when Dr. Vernon made his mistake. The old man lurched forward, trying to grab Sarah, trying to pull her back. "Don't, please." The leader's backhand sent Vernon sprawling again. Blood sprayed across the snow-dusted floor. "Old man wants to be a hero?" One of the nervous ones raised his rifle toward Vernon's head. Catherine was already moving. She came out of her position low and fast, the crowbar swinging in a tight arc. The nervous one never saw it coming. The steel caught him across the temple with a sound like a hammer striking meat. He dropped, weapon clattering. Catherine caught the rifle before it hit the ground. The world slowed down. Everything became geometric angles and distances, threats prioritized by proximity and capability. Her hands checked the weapon in 2 seconds. AK pattern, 30-round magazine, selector on full auto, condition amber. Chamber loaded. The second nervous one was turning, mouth opening to shout. Catherine put 3 rounds center mass from 15 feet. Controlled bursts, the way she'd been trained 11 years ago. He went down. The man at the side entrance was bringing his weapon up. Catherine dropped to one knee, used the metal cabinet as cover, fired 4 rounds through the gap. 2 hit. He staggered back through the doorway, then everything erupted. The remaining insurgents opened fire, muzzle flashes strobing through the tent. Patients screamed. Staff threw themselves flat. Bullets punched through canvas and ricocheted off metal frames. Catherine was already moving to her next position, using the tent poles and supply stations as cover. Her mind was completely clear, operating on instincts carved into her nervous system through thousands of hours of training. She wasn't thinking in words anymore, just reading the environment, processing threats, executing. The man by the surgical tent fired a burst that tore through the cabinet where she'd been 2 seconds before. Catherine came around the other side, dropped him with a controlled pair to the chest. 4 down, at least 6 remaining, plus the ones outside. The leader had released Sarah and was bringing his own weapon to bear. Catherine dove behind a row of beds, came up firing, forcing him back through the entrance into the storm. "Lights out," she shouted to anyone listening. "Kill the emergency lights." For a long second, nobody moved. Then Sarah Chen, despite her zip-tied hands, stumbled to the battery pack and kicked it. The LED strips died. Darkness swallowed the tent. Catherine was already moving toward the rear exit, toward the generator shed, toward the high ground. In the chaos and screaming, nobody saw her go. Nobody saw her climb the ladder to the observation platform, a maintenance walkway installed on the generator shed roof for checking the fuel lines. Nobody saw her take position, 20 feet up, with a clear field of fire over the entire compound. Below her, flashlights stabbed through the darkness as the remaining insurgents regrouped. She counted 6 distinct lights, 6 targets. Catherine settled the rifle against her shoulder, controlled her breathing, and became what she'd sworn never to be again. The observation platform was a skeleton of metal scaffolding bolted to the generator shed's roof, installed 3 weeks ago when the fuel pumps started failing and someone needed to access the lines from above. It wasn't designed for what Catherine was using it for, now prone shooting in sub-zero temperatures with 50-mile-per-hour winds trying to throw her off the narrow walkway. But it would do. She'd grabbed more than just the rifle on her way out. A tactical vest from the security station Marcus's spare, still hanging on the wall where he'd left it that morning. It carried 4 additional magazines, a knife, and a small LED flashlight. Not much, but more than she'd had 2 minutes ago. The rifle was the problem. AK pattern weapons were reliable, nearly indestructible, perfect for combat conditions. But they weren't precision instruments. Effective range of 300 meters for a trained shooter, maybe 400 in ideal conditions. These weren't ideal conditions. The blizzard turned the compound into a chaos of swirling white. Visibility fluctuated between 20 feet and 0. The wind pushed hard from the northwest, gusting unpredictably. Temperature was still dropping, probably -20 now. Cold enough that the rifle's metal parts were starting to freeze against her skin through her thin scrubs. Catherine ignored all of it. She'd trained in worse. Norway, 7 years ago, winter warfare course in conditions that made this look mild. She'd put rounds on target at 600 meters in whiteout conditions, using rifles far less sophisticated than this one. The difference was, back then she'd been wearing proper cold weather gear, had a spotter calling wind, and wasn't trying to avoid killing her own people. Below her, the insurgents were regrouping near the main entrance. 6 flashlights she'd counted correctly. The leader was shouting orders, organizing them into a search formation. They knew someone had fought back, but they thought it was security personnel. Marcus, maybe, having freed himself somehow. They were looking for a man with a sidearm, someone hiding in the tents. They weren't looking up. Catherine settled into position, prone, elbows braced on the metal walkway, rifle steady despite the platform's subtle movement in the wind. She regulated her breathing, 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. Her heart rate dropped to 55 beats per minute. The world narrowed to the sights, the targets, the wind. She'd have to improvise for elevation. The rifle had iron sights, no optics, and she had no way to verify 0. She'd have to estimate based on the weapon's condition and hope it was close to standard. Windage was going to be the real problem. Gusts were unpredictable, and she couldn't see the trace of her rounds in the snow. First shot would tell her everything. First shot would also tell them where she was. Make it count. The leader moved into the open, directing 2 of his men toward the supply depot. Clear shot. 40 meters. Slight elevation advantage. Wind from the left, gusting, maybe 30 kilometers per hour average. Catherine's finger moved to the trigger. Proper finger placement pad of the first joint, perpendicular to the barrel axis. She'd done this 10,000 times in training. Hundreds of times in operations she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. 3 pounds of pressure. That's all it took. She thought about the people inside the hospital. Dr. Vernon with his broken mouth, still trying to help. Sarah Chen, terrified but brave enough to kill the lights. Corporal Reeves, 1 leg gone, defenseless in his bed. The civilian Garrett who might deserve what was coming but didn't deserve to have everyone else die with him. She thought about the promise she'd made herself. Never again. Never put the rifle in her hands again. Never become that person again. Then, she thought about what would happen if she didn't. Catherine Brennan, night nurse, emergency medicine, just trying to help people she stopped existing. Someone else took over. Someone cold and precise and absolutely lethal. She exhaled slowly, acquired the target, and pressed the trigger. The rifle cracked sharp, clear, cutting through the wind's howl like a blade through silk. 40 meters downrange, the insurgent leader stopped mid-sentence. His flashlight dropped. He staggered 2 steps, clutching his chest, then collapsed into the snow that was already beginning to cover him. Perfect center mass. The shot had been true. Below, chaos erupted. "Sniper! Sniper!" The shout came from 3 different throats simultaneously, panic turning the word into something raw and primal. The remaining 5 scattered like birds from a shotgun blast, flashlights spinning wild arcs through the darkness as they dove for cover. Catherine was already moving. She rolled right, off the position where muzzle flash had marked her location, and low-crawled 10 feet along the platform to a new angle. Rounds started coming up at her previous position, wild, undisciplined fire. Exactly what she'd expected from fighters who'd just lost their leader and didn't know where the threat was coming from. They were firing at shadows, at the place they thought she'd been, wasting ammunition into the storm. She counted the seconds between bursts, identified 3 different weapons by sound, 2 more AK pattern rifles, and something heavier, maybe a light machine gun. That was new. That was a problem. The LMG could tear through her cover, could spray the entire platform with enough rounds that her position wouldn't matter. Find him first. Catherine swept her rifle across the compound, using the insurgents' own muzzle flashes to mark positions. There by the supply tent, a heavier, sustained burst. The LMG. The operator was prone behind a supply crate, good cover, established position. 45 meters. Elevated shot, downward angle, wind still gusting from the northwest. But she had a better read on it. Now the first shot had pulled 6 inches left, which meant she needed to aim right, compensate for the cross breeze. The LMG operator fired another burst, tracers streaking up toward the generator shed. Catherine waited. 3 seconds. 4. He'd have to pause to reload, or at least to check his belt feed. There, the instant his fire stopped, she acquired him in her sights. He was shifting position, preparing to move to better cover. She led the movement by 2 feet, adjusted for wind, and fired. The round caught him in the upper torso. He went down, the LMG clattering away across the frozen ground. 4 down, 4 to go. But now they were adapting. The remaining insurgents had stopped panicking, stopped firing blindly. They'd gone quiet, gone to ground, using proper cover. One of them started suppressing her position with controlled bursts, 3-round groups, professional, keeping her pinned while the others maneuvered. Catherine pressed herself flat against the metal platform. Rounds sparked off the scaffolding inches from her head. The shooter had her pinned. She couldn't move without exposing herself, couldn't return fire without giving him a target. Stalemate. Then a voice cut through the storm, amplified by a handheld radio. "Medical personnel. We have hostages. Show yourself or we start executing them." Catherine's chest tightened. They'd regrouped inside the hospital. She'd driven them back into the building where all the helpless people were. Through the blowing snow, she could just make out movement near the main entrance. 2 insurgents dragging someone outside a patient. From the looks of it, one of the bedridden ones, unable to run. They positioned him in the open, forced him to his knees in the snow. "You have 30 seconds, the voice called. "Then he dies. Then we bring out another. We'll kill them all." The patient was crying, begging, his voice almost lost in the wind. Catherine couldn't see his face clearly through the snow, but she could see enough. Young, 20, maybe 25. Someone's son. 20 seconds. The insurgent behind him raised his pistol. 15 seconds. Catherine had the shot. 50 meters, difficult angle, the patient partially blocking a clean hit. If she missed by inches, she'd kill the hostage herself. 10 seconds. She controlled her breathing, felt the wind, read the swirling snow like it was a language she'd once spoken fluently and never quite forgotten. 5 seconds. She fired. The insurgent's head snapped back. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The pistol fell unfired into the snow. The patient collapsed forward, sobbing with relief. And Catherine, 20 feet above the chaos, chambered another round and searched for her next target. The compound had become a maze of shadow and snow. Every tent and structure transformed into potential cover or concealment. 3 insurgents left. Catherine tracked them by sound, by movement, by the small mistakes men made when fear started overriding training. She'd abandoned the observation platform. Too exposed now, too obvious. They knew approximately where she was, and they'd started working together to suppress and flank her position. So she'd moved, climbed down the back side of the generator shed, dropped into the snow, and begun working her way through the compound's periphery. The cold was becoming a factor now. Her scrubs were soaked through from snow, offering no insulation. Her hands were starting to lose fine motor control, fingers stiffening around the rifle. Her breath created clouds of vapor that could give away her position. None of it was ideal, but none of it was fatal yet. She'd operated in worse. Catherine moved through the space between the generator shed and the surgical tent, using the storm as cover, her white nurse's uniform blending into the snow. Behind her, she heard shouts. One of the remaining insurgents had found the body of his leader. Rage, grief, promises of revenge. Good. Angry men made mistakes. She reached the corner of the surgical tent and paused, listening. 2 voices, close, speaking in urgent whispers. Planning. They were setting up a crossfire, trying to box her in. Smart. If she'd stayed on the platform, it might have worked. Catherine circled wide, putting the surgical tent between herself and their voices. The fallen snow was over a foot deep now, drifting higher in places where the wind piled it against structures. She moved through it carefully, placing each step to minimize sound, a skill that came back like riding a bicycle you never really forgot. A flashlight beam swept across the snow 10 feet to her right. She froze, became a statue, let the light pass over and beyond. The insurgent was moving toward the generator shed, rifle up, checking corners. He was alone, tactical error, splitting from his partner. They were scared, disorganized, making the kind of mistakes that got you killed. Catherine followed him, 20 feet back, silent as the falling snow, her rifle up and ready. She could take him now, easy shot from behind, but the muzzle flash would give away her position to the others. Better to wait. Better to let him lead her to them. He reached the generator shed, called out in his own language. No response. He called again, louder, worried now. Where was his leader? Where were the others? Then he turned, and his flashlight beam caught Catherine standing 15 feet behind him. For one frozen second, they stared at each other. He saw her a woman in blood-stained scrubs, holding a rifle like she'd been born with it, her face absolutely calm. Not the terrified medical worker he'd expected. Something else entirely. He started to bring his rifle up. Catherine shot him through the heart. She was moving before he hit the ground, before the sound of the shot finished echoing, because now everyone knew where she was. She sprinted toward the medical supply tent, rounds chasing her, kicking up snow around her feet. One grazed her shoulder, hot pain, superficial. She ignored it. She dove through the supply tent entrance, rolled, came up behind a stack of water containers. 2 insurgents were advancing on her position from different angles. They were coordinating now, learning, adapting. The one on the left was firing to suppress her, while the one on the right maneuvered closer. Catherine let him come. She waited until he was at the entrance, outlined against the white darkness outside, then put 2 rounds into his center mass. He fell backward into the snow. 1 left. She could hear him breathing hard, panicked now. He was alone, his entire team dead, and somewhere in the blizzard was a ghost who'd picked them apart one by one. He started shouting for mercy in broken English. Please, please, I surrender. Don't shoot. Catherine stepped out from behind the water containers, rifle raised. The man was on his knees in the snow, hands up, weapon thrown aside. Young, maybe 19, tears freezing on his face. She almost pulled the trigger anyway. Part of her, the cold, efficient part that had been forged in training and hardened in operations, said to eliminate the threat completely. No prisoners, no witnesses, no loose ends. But that was the old her, the person she'd sworn not to be anymore. Catherine kept him covered and shouted toward the hospital. "Marcus, I need zip ties and someone to secure a prisoner." Catherine was wrong about the count. She realized it the moment Lieutenant Marcus Webb emerged from the hospital, Sarah Chen behind him, both of them staring at her with expressions caught between relief and shock. Because as Marcus moved to secure the surrendered insurgent, Catherine caught movement in her peripheral vision, a figure slipping between the storage tent and the northern perimeter fence. A 10th man. Had to be. Someone who'd stayed back, stayed quiet, let the others do the fighting while he waited for exactly this moment. And he was heading toward the hospital's rear entrance. "Marcus, behind me!" Catherine spun, brought her rifle up, but the figure was already disappearing into the storm. She sprinted after him, heard Marcus shouting for her to wait, didn't wait. She reached the rear entrance 5 seconds later, weapon up, finger on the trigger. The canvas flap was still moving he'd just gone through. Inside, she could hear patients crying, someone praying, Dr. Vernon's voice trying to calm everyone. Catherine entered tactical, rifle sweeping left to right, clearing angles, reading the space. The insurgent was there near the ICU section, his rifle aimed not at the staff, but at the patient in bed 3. Garrett. The whole reason they'd come? "Don't move," the man said. His English was much better than the others, his voice steady despite everything. "Don't move or I put 10 rounds into him." Catherine held position, rifle trained on him. "He's already dying. You got what you came for." "No." The man shook his head. "We came to make him suffer. Make him see his friends die. Make him know what he did to us." He was crying now, tears streaming down his face. "Do you know what he did? This colonel? This hero?" Catherine didn't answer. Garrett was semi-conscious, eyes half open. Probably couldn't understand what was happening. He ordered the airstrike. "My village. 200 people. My wife. My daughter." The man's voice broke. She was 7. 7 years old. "I'm sorry," Catherine said. And she meant it. She'd seen what war did to people, how it ground them down until nothing was left but pain and rage. "Are you?" The man's finger moved to the trigger. "Sorry enough to let me finish this?" Catherine's mind ran the calculations. He was 12 feet away. His rifle was pointed at Garrett, but he could swing it toward her in under a second. If she fired, he might still get a burst-off kill Garrett, kill others. If she didn't fire, he'd definitely kill Garrett. "If you do this," she said slowly, "you die. You know that." "I know. And it doesn't bring them back. Nothing brings them back." His finger tightened on the trigger. "But maybe I sleep better." Catherine saw it in his eyes, the finality. He'd made his decision. He was going to do it. She had less than a second to make her own choice. She could shoot him. Clean shot. He'd die before finishing the pull. But he was a victim too, in his own way. Turned into a killer by circumstances beyond his control. By orders given by men like Garrett, who never had to see the faces of the people their decisions destroyed. Or she could let him finish it. Let him have his justice, however dark. Garrett's own orders had killed innocents. Why should he be protected? But that wasn't her call to make. She was a nurse now. She saved people. That's what nurses did. Catherine made her choice. She shot him through the head. He dropped instantly, fingers still on the trigger, but the neural signal interrupted before it could complete. His rifle clattered to the floor, unfired. Garrett, barely conscious, didn't even know how close he'd come. Catherine lowered her weapon and stood there for a long moment, looking at the body. Another dead man, another name on a list she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Behind her, Marcus Webb entered, saw the scene, saw her standing there with the rifle still smoking. "Jesus Christ, Kate," he whispered. "Who the hell are you?" Catherine didn't answer. She wasn't sure she knew anymore. The rescue convoy arrived at 0620 hours, as the blizzard finally exhausted itself and the sky began to lighten from black to gray. Catherine heard the engines before. She saw the vehicles, 2 armored personnel carriers and a supply truck, headlights cutting through the last swirls of snow. She was sitting on an overturned crate outside the main entrance, the rifle across her knees, watching the perimeter. Marcus had offered to take it from her twice. She'd refused both times. Until the compound was secure, until reinforcements arrived, she wasn't letting it go. Her shoulder hurt where the round had grazed her. Sarah had cleaned and bandaged it, hands shaking the whole time. Her hands were numb from cold, and she was probably in the early stages of hypothermia. None of it seemed important. The convoy commander was a major named Rebecca Stone, mid-40s, with the efficient manner of someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with emergencies. She took in the scene quickly, the bodies in the snow, the damaged hospital, the exhausted survivors, and started issuing orders. Medics moved through the tents, triaging and stabilizing. Engineers began temporary repairs. Security personnel swept the compound and established a proper perimeter. Everything Catherine had been doing for the past 4 hours, but with proper resources and actual equipment. Major Stone approached Catherine, took one look at her, and said, "You're the one who held them off." "Yes, ma'am. Lieutenant Webb gave me the brief. 10 hostiles. You eliminated 9 and captured 1. Stone's expression was unreadable. "That's some very impressive work for a night nurse." Catherine said nothing. "You're hypothermic. Go inside, get warm, let the medics check you over." "I'm fine." "That wasn't a suggestion, Nurse Brennan." Catherine finally stood, handed the rifle to Marcus. Her legs were unsteady, adrenaline crash, cold, exhaustion all hitting at once. Marcus steadied her, his hand on her elbow. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You saved all of us." Catherine nodded and let him guide her back into the hospital. Inside, the lights were back on. The engineers had already repaired the cut line. Everything looked normal again, almost like the past few hours had been a bad dream, except for the blood on the floor, the bullet holes in the canvas, the way everyone looked at her with gratitude, yes, but also with fear, with uncertainty, with questions they didn't know how to ask. Dr. Vernon found her in the supply tent, where she'd gone to inventory the damage. His jaw was bandaged, his speech slurred, but he managed. The major's asking questions. "About your background, your training." "I know. What should I tell her?" Catherine continued counting morphine vials, marking quantities on her clipboard. "Tell her I'm a nurse. That's all I am." "Kate." "That's all I am," she repeated, more firmly. "Everything else is classified. Everything else is none of her business. Everything else is over." Vernon studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Okay, but Kate, you know you can't put this back in the box. Not after tonight. They'll want answers. Then they'll be disappointed." She finished her inventory and moved to the next task, then the next. Work, routine, the normal rhythm of hospital life. If she just kept moving, kept working, maybe she could convince herself that nothing had changed. Maybe she could convince herself that the person who'd picked off 9 armed men in a blizzard was someone else entirely. Maybe she could go back to being just a nurse, but she knew that was a lie. 3 days later, the field hospital was operating normally again. The holes in the canvas had been patched. The bullet casings had been swept up. A new security detail had arrived, 20 soldiers instead of 12, with proper perimeter defenses and early warning systems. The wounded had been evacuated to better facilities. The dead had been identified, documented, and removed. Everything back to normal. Except nothing was normal at all. Catherine moved through her shifts like a ghost, doing her job with the same precision she'd always shown. But something fundamental had shifted. The staff treated her differently now, respectfully, but with distance. Even Dr. Vernon, who'd seen her at her most vulnerable, maintained a professional remove. Major Stone had interviewed her twice, pressing for details about her training, her background, her service history. Catherine had given her nothing, just repeated the same story. Civilian nurse, emergency medicine, acted on instinct. The major didn't believe her, but without access to Catherine's military records, which were sealed so deep that even a major's clearance couldn't touch them, there was nothing she could do about it. The captured insurgent had talked, eventually, told them about the village, about Garrett's orders, about the revenge that had driven them here. He'd be tried in a military tribunal, probably spend the rest of his life in prison. Catherine tried not to think about whether that was justice or just more collateral damage from a war that had no winners. On the 4th night, Catherine was alone in the main ward, doing her rounds. Most of the patients were sleeping. Outside, fresh snow was falling, gentle this time, not the killing storm from before. The world was quiet. Dr. Vernon found her by the window, watching the snow. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Transfer came through this morning. They're moving me to a hospital in Germany. Safer," they said. "More appropriate for someone of my qualifications." "They're scared of you." "Probably." Catherine turned from the window. "I'm scared of me too, Vernon. Scared of how easy it was, how natural. I put that life away 3 years ago, swore I'd never touch a weapon again. Then I touched one, and it was like I'd never stopped. You saved lives. By taking them, by defending people who couldn't defend themselves." Vernon moved closer, his voice gentle. "Kate, whatever you did before, whoever you were, that person saved everyone here. I won't forget that. None of us will. Catherine nodded slowly. I know, but I can't stay. Every time someone looks at me now, they see the shooter, not the nurse. And I need to be the nurse. That's who I chose to be. Vernon understood. He pulled her into a brief embrace the first time they'd touched in anything other than a professional capacity. Take care of yourself, Kate. You too. She left the next morning at dawn, her single duffel bag packed, her transfer orders in hand. The last thing she saw of the field hospital was Dr. Vernon standing at the entrance, one hand raised in farewell. Catherine didn't look back. She'd been a soldier once, had done things she'd never speak about, earned medals they'd never give her, and killed people whose names she'd never know. Then she'd been a nurse, saving lives instead of ending them. Now she was something else, something in between. A guardian who'd never wanted to be one again, who'd proven she couldn't quite escape what she'd been trained to become. She'd saved them all, and in doing so, had lost the anonymity that had allowed her to save herself. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some people were meant to be weapons, even when they tried to be healers. Maybe the best thing she could do was accept both parts of herself and find a way to live with the contradiction. The convoy rolled through the snow, carrying her toward Germany, toward another hospital, toward another attempt at normal life. Catherine closed her eyes and tried not to think about how it had felt, the rifle in her hands, the targets in her sights, the absolute clarity of purpose. She tried not to think about how much she'd missed it. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything in white silence. This story explores the tension between identity and necessity, between who we choose to be and who we're trained to become. Catherine Brennan spent years trying to escape her past as a military sniper, building a new identity as a healer. But when circumstances demanded it, that training surfaced instantly, proving that some skills are carved too deep to ever fully abandon. The narrative deliberately maintains a cold, controlled tone that mirrors Catherine's mental state during the crisis detachment as survival mechanism, precision as comfort. The violence is present, but not glorified. Each shot is a calculated decision, not a triumphant moment. War creates people like Catherine, individuals, trained to exceptional lethality, then asked to simply turn it off and reintegrate into peaceful society. This story asks, can they? Should they? And what happens when the skills we're trying to forget become the only thing standing between innocent people and death? The blizzard serves as both physical obstacle and metaphor, obscuring vision, creating chaos, forcing Catherine to rely on training that operates below conscious thought. In the white darkness, she becomes purely instinctual, reverting to what she knows best. The ending offers no easy answers. Catherine saved everyone.